Greetings, weary traveler, and welcome to a story not of glory, but of truth. The great battles of Westeros were rarely noble clashes of destiny. The grim reality is that they were visceral, chaotic affairs, exercises in organized butchery, decided by terror, desperation, and the kind of mud that swallows a warhorse whole. Tonight, we are not celebrating heroes. We are conducting a historical survey of the continent's absolute worst days. From the field that was scorched into glass to the frozen battle against oblivion itself. Now, with the lights low and your mind at ease, let's examine the true cost of a crown. Welcome to the open plains of the Northern Reach, circa the second year of Aegon's conquest. Picture this. You are a foot soldier, drafted from some village that smells perpetually of pig manure and regret. You are marching in the combined host of the two kings, the mightiest army this continent has ever seen, 60,000 men, a forest of spears and banners under a summer sky. The mood is confident, arrogant even. You've been told the Targaryen invaders are a band of foreign pretenders with delusions of grandeur. Their army is a fraction of your own. The ground begins to tremble, not from cavalry, but from something else. A shadow passes overhead, then another, and a third. They are larger than you were told, much larger. A roar splits the sky. It is not the sound of a beast. It is the sound of reality tearing itself apart. Then comes the heat. This is the field of fire. It is not a battle. It is an extermination. The Targaryen strategy was brutally, elegantly simple. Aegon and his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, did not engage the massive force assembled by King Mern Ix Gardner of the Reach and King Loren I Lannister of the Rock. To do so would have been suicide. Their own army, a collection of loyalists from the newly conquered Riverlands and Stormlands, was outnumbered more than 5-1. Instead, they relied on a unique, and frankly unfair, strategic asset: 3 fully grown dragons. Balerion, Meraxes, and Vergar were not simply beasts of war. They were living weapons of mass destruction, the absolute apex predators of this world. And the Gardner-Lannister alliance had performed a catastrophic failure in threat assessment. The kings of the Rock and the Reach had drawn up their forces on a wide, dry plain, perfect for a grand cavalry charge. They imagined a glorious, conventional victory where their superior numbers would simply overwhelm the Targaryen position. Their tactical planning failed to account for the fact that their opponents could fly. Aegon and his sisters descended upon them from above, not with arrows or stones, but with a coordinated, systematic tide of dragon flame. The dry grass of the plains ignited in an instant, creating a wall of fire that encircled the allied army, turning their battlefield into a colossal oven. Panic was immediate and absolute. The orderly lines of infantry dissolved into a screaming mob, blinded by smoke, choked by ash, and trampled by their own comrades. Let's just say this was less a military engagement and more a large-scale, unscheduled cremation. The proud knights of the Reach, paragons of chivalry encased in steel plate, discovered a fatal design flaw in their expensive armor. It conducted heat beautifully. Men were cooked alive before they could even attempt to flee. The Lannister spearmen, renowned for their discipline, broke and ran, only to be consumed by the inferno their kings had led them into. The noise was not of clashing steel, but of a singular 60,000-man scream, which was slowly silenced by the roar of the flames. The smell was of burning grass, melting steel, and roasting meat on a scale that would render an entire generation of survivors staunch vegetarians. It was a complete sensory overload of horror, a targeted application of overwhelming force designed not merely to defeat an army, but to annihilate the very idea of resistance. King Mern X, along with his sons, nephews, and the entire leadership of House Gardner was incinerated. His ancient bloodline, which had ruled the Reach for thousands of years, was extinguished in a single afternoon. King Loren Lannister, exhibiting a sudden and profound clarity of purpose, survived. He managed to escape the flames, and upon seeing the smoking, glassy field where his army used to be, he made a swift and pragmatic career decision. He rode to Aegon, threw his crown at the conqueror's feet, and bent the knee. He was allowed to rise as Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. He lost his crown, but he kept his head, his castle, and his life, proving that even a Lannister knows a bad investment when he sees one. The lore coda for this event is stark and absolute. The Field of Fire was the single most important battle of Aegon's conquest. It was not the largest in terms of combatants, but it was the most decisive. It broke the back of the single greatest military alliance ever raised against the Targaryens and demonstrated the futility of opposing them with conventional arms. 4,000 men were burned to death. 10,000 more were captured. The entire political landscape of Westeros was redrawn in its aftermath. House Gardner ceased to exist, their vast lands and titles granted to their stewards, the Tyrells, whose primary qualification was a willingness to immediately surrender. The Lannisters were humbled, transformed from proud kings into loyal vassals. The message sent to the remaining independent kingdoms was unambiguous: bend the knee, or your fields will become glass and your castles will become tombs. 186 years after the Field of Fire, the existential threat of dragons has been replaced by a far more intimate, and arguably uglier, form of warfare: civil war. Welcome to the Redgrass Field, the bloody climax of the First Blackfire Rebellion. There are no dragons here. There is only steel, mud, and bad blood. Picture this. You are no longer a conscript facing a cosmic horror. You are a household knight, sworn to a lord who has chosen his side in a dynastic dispute that you only vaguely understand. The man fighting opposite you is not a foreign invader. He wears the same style of armor as you. He prays to the same 7 gods. He might be your cousin. The noise is a constant, grinding roar of metal on metal, of men screaming and horses dying. The ground beneath your feet is no longer grass. It is a slick, crimson mud composed of dirt, water, and the blood of thousands. This is not a clean, decisive inferno from above. This is a human meat grinder. Every inch of ground is gained through exhaustion and brute force. And the only thing more sickening than the fear of death is the realization that the kingdom is committing suicide right in front of you. This entire catastrophe was a parting gift from King Aegon IV, a man so aptly nicknamed the Unworthy, that it feels like an understatement. On his deathbed, in a final act of what can only be described as historic trolling, he legitimized all of his numerous bastards. This single declaration threw a grenade into the line of succession, transforming his noble, born illegitimate children from embarrassing secrets into viable political rivals. The most prominent of these was Daemon, a warrior of prodigious skill and charisma. Aegon IV had previously gifted him Blackfire, the ancestral Valyrian steel sword of Targaryen kings, a public endorsement that was as subtle as a brick to the face. Daemon took the sword's name for his own, creating House Blackfire. On the other side was the legitimate king, Daeron II, a thoughtful, scholarly man more interested in diplomacy and reform than in swords or glory. His greatest sin, in the eyes of many martial lords, was being peaceful. He brought Dawn into the 7 kingdoms through a marriage pact, not conquest, and his court was filled with Dornish nobles, artists, and scholars. This cultural shift was perceived as weakness by a significant portion of the Old Guard. who preferred the familiar comforts of xenophobia and casual brutality. They saw in Daemon Blackfire a return to a more authentic and warrior-like past. The kingdom fractured. It was the jocks versus the nerds, with the fate of the nation as the prize. Let's be clear, this was not a war of high ideals. It was a kingdom-wide identity crisis, fueled by resentment and weaponized nostalgia. The Blackfire Rebellion was less a noble cause and more a deeply dysfunctional family argument that spilled out of the throne room and onto the battlefield. The lords who flocked to Daemon's Black Dragon banner did so not for freedom, but because they disliked the new Dornish foreign exchange students at court, or because Daeron had raised their taxes, or simply because Daemon looked the part of a king in a way the bookish Daeron never could. It was a war of image over substance, a political campaign conducted with longswords. The Battle of the Redgrass Field was the inevitable, bloody result of this schism. For hours, the two armies butchered each other with a grim and personal ferocity. Daemon Blackfire himself was a whirlwind of destruction, cutting down foes and inspiring his men with every kill. His rival and half-brother, Aegur Bittersteel, Rivers, another of the great bastards, commanded the right flank with savage determination. For a time, it seemed the rebels would carry the day through sheer martial prowess. But King Daeron had his own trump card. Another great bastard, a man who represented a third, more sinister path. Brendan Rivers, the albino sorcerer and spymaster known as Bloodraven. He was not on the front lines. He was on a hill, a third of a mile away, with his personal company of elite archers, the Raven's Teeth. While Daemon dueled with a knight of the Kingsguard, Bloodraven saw his moment. This was not about honor. This was pest control. He unleashed a volley. The first arrow took Daemon's eldest son, Aegon. Daemon, stunned with grief, was an easy target. A storm of arrows struck him, and the charismatic leader of the rebellion fell dead. The second volley killed his other son, Aemon. It was a targeted assassination in the middle of a pitched battle, a cold, calculated move that shattered the rebels' morale completely. The heart of their movement was carved out in a matter of seconds. The lore coda of the Redgrass Field is a lesson in the persistence of political wounds. The Royalists won the day, and Bittersteel was forced to flee into exile in Essos with Daemon's surviving sons. But the rebellion was not truly over. It had simply entered a new phase. Bittersteel would found the Golden Company, a mercenary army whose sole purpose was to one day place a Blackfire on the Iron Throne. For the next 80 years, the Blackfire pretenders would be a recurring political cancer for the Targaryen dynasty, launching a total of 5 separate invasions. The Redgrass Field solved nothing. It merely institutionalized the conflict, creating a legacy of paranoia, bloodshed, and a bitter, multi-generational rivalry that poisoned the nobility and weakened the Targaryen grip on power long before the final fall. We move forward another century. The Blackfire cancer has been excised, but the Targaryen dynasty has developed a new sickness: madness. We have arrived at the single most romanticized and misunderstood battle in modern Westerosi history. The Battle of the Trident. Picture the scene. You are standing waist deep in the cold, fast-moving water of the Trident River. All around you, men are screaming, drowning, and dying. The Loyalist army holds one bank. You and the rebel host are trying to force a crossing on the other. This isn't an open field, it's a choked, chaotic kill zone. Arrows rain down, turning the river's surface into a pin cushion. You struggle for footing on slick, moss-covered rocks, bodies bumping against your legs in the current. This is not a battle of grand tactics. It is a desperate, violent scrum. A brawl in a river. The context for this bloody affair is Robert's rebellion, a war sparked not by careful political calculation, but by pure, unadulterated rage. It began when the crown prince, Rhaegar Targaryen, either abducted or eloped with Lyanna Stark, the betrothed of Lord Robert Baratheon. When Lyanna's father and brother went to King's Landing to demand justice, the Mad King, Aerys II, murdered them in a display of sadistic cruelty. In response, Robert Baratheon, Ned Stark, and their guardian Jon Arryn called their banners. This was not a war of succession. It was a war of vengeance, a blood feud that had spiraled into a continental conflict. After a year of brutal fighting, the two armies met here, at this crucial river crossing, for what everyone knew would be the decisive engagement. The two central figures were walking legends. On the rebel side stood Robert Baratheon, a force of nature in human form, a whirlwind of charisma, fury, and booze, wielding a warhammer so massive only he could effectively use it in one hand. He was the heart of the rebellion. On the royalist side was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the silver-haired, harp-playing intellectual, beloved by the small folk and obsessed with prophecy. He was the last, best hope of a dying dynasty, a tragic figure trapped between his father's madness and his own questionable life choices. The entire war, with its tens of thousands of combatants, had become intensely personal, a narrative focused entirely on these two men. Let's just say, the fate of the Seven Kingdoms was ultimately a secondary concern to the primary objective, a deeply personal grudge match. This was less a battle for the soul of the nation and more a violent resolution to the world's worst love triangle. The tactical complexities of the river crossing, the flanking maneuvers, the desperate charges, all of it became a mere backdrop for the main event. While thousands of men were drowning in the muck, the two leaders sought each other out in the churning chaos of the ford. They were not just commanders, they were the final bosses of each other's stories. Their duel was the stuff of song, and for once, the songs aren't entirely wrong, though they miss the sheer, visceral brutality of it. This was not an elegant dance of swords. It was a clash between a graceful fencer and a human battering ram. Rhaegar, clad in black armor studded with rubies, wounded Robert. But Robert, fueled by a bottomless well of rage, endured. He swung his massive hammer. The impact was sickening. It didn't slice or pierce. It crushed. The blow caved in Rhaegar's chest, shattering his armor and ribs. The rubies that formed the three-headed dragon of his house were blasted from their setting, scattering into the river like bloody tears, giving the crossing its name forever after the Ruby Ford. Let's call it the most expensive wardrobe malfunction in history. The effect was instantaneous. Rhaegar Targaryen, the hope of his house, fell dead in the water. The royalist army, which had been fighting fiercely, saw its prince and commander slain. Their morale did not just break, it evaporated. The line shattered into a full-blown rout. Men threw down their weapons and fled, were cut down from behind, or simply drowned in their panic. With one swing of a hammer, the battle was over, and a dynasty died with it. The lore coda for the Trident is monumental. This single combat victory sealed the fate of House Targaryen. With Rhaegar dead and the royalist army broken, the path to King's Landing was wide open, leading directly to the infamous sack of the capital and the murder of the remaining royals. Robert Baratheon's rebellion had succeeded, and he would soon sit the Iron Throne. But the victory was a hollow one, built on rage and loss. Robert won the throne but lost the woman he fought for, and he would spend his reign as a bitter, dissolute king, better at conquering a kingdom than ruling one. The Battle of the Trident ended a war, but it planted the seeds of the next one. creating a new political order that was inherently unstable and haunted by the ghosts of the men who fell in that bloody river. We push forward 9 years into the reign of King Robert I of his name. The Targaryen threat is a memory, and a fragile peace has settled over the 7 kingdoms. It is, of course, too good to last, because one man, sitting on a damp and miserable rock in the sea, decides to misread the entire geopolitical situation. Welcome to the Siege of Pike, the spectacular failure of the Greyjoy Rebellion. Picture yourself on the deck of a warship. The air is thick with salt spray and the stench of nervous men. All around you is the assembled might of the 7 kingdoms. Not one army, but all of them, united under the Baratheon banner. Your target is a series of bleak, windswept towers built on stone stacks, connected by swaying rope bridges over a churning, angry sea. This is Pike, the ancestral seat of House Greyjoy. It looks less like a castle and more like a fortress designed by a suicidal architect. The siege will not be fought on open ground. It will be fought on water, on rock, and in the freezing, unforgiving spray. The cause of this conflict was a profound, almost admirable, level of delusion on the part of Lord Balon Greyjoy. The Ironborn, the people of the Iron Islands, have a cultural identity built on what they call the Old Way. This is a romanticized vision of their past as sea-faring pirates and raiders who paid the iron price for their possessions. Let's just say their entire philosophy is a celebration of armed robbery. Balon, ignoring the fact that his people had been repeatedly crushed every time they tried this in the past, declared himself king of the Iron Islands and attacked the mainland. It was a rebellion born from nostalgia and a complete inability to read the room. Poking the man who had just crushed the Targaryen dynasty was, to put it mildly, a bad career move. Robert Baratheon's response was not one of negotiation. It was one of overwhelming, unified force. This was not a war between 2 rival powers. This was a continental superpower swatting a fly. First, Robert's brother, Stannis, commanded the royal fleet and methodically smashed the legendary Iron Fleet to pieces off the coast of Fair Isle. With their navy destroyed, the Ironborn were trapped on their islands, their greatest strategic advantage eliminated. The subsequent invasion was less a battle and more a large-scale punitive expedition. The lords of Westeros, including Ned Stark, Tywin Lannister, and Barristan Selmy, descended upon the Iron Islands with a singular purpose: to remind Balon Greyjoy of his place. The Siege of Pike itself was the brutal finale. The castle was famously difficult to assault, built as it was across multiple sea stacks. But the combined forces of the Crown brought with them an army of engineers and immense siege engines. For days the castle was bombarded. The grinding sound of trebuchets, the whistle of massive stones flying through the air, and the crash of impact became the new soundtrack of the islands. The main keep's southern wall was systematically battered until it cracked, groaned, and finally collapsed into the sea. The fortress was breached. Let us be perfectly clear. The Greyjoy Rebellion was a catastrophic failure in strategic planning. Balon Greyjoy launched a hostile takeover of his own sovereignty, based on a business model the old way. That had been obsolete for centuries. He wagered that the new Baratheon regime was unstable, and that the great lords would not unite behind their new king. He was wrong. The Siege of Pike was Robert's version of a mandatory compliance audit. When the walls came down, the king himself, older and heavier, but still possessing a terrifying fury, led the charge through the breach to personally deliver the audit's findings. Thoros of Myr, a red priest more interested in wine and combat than gods, was the first one through the gap, his sword magically aflame. a detail that must have been deeply confusing for the Ironborn defenders. The fighting inside the castle was desperate and bloody, a bottleneck of steel and slaughter in the rubble of the fallen wall. Balon's two eldest sons, Roderick and Meryn, were killed in the fighting. The rebellion bled out in the halls of its own keep. Balon, his forces shattered and his heirs dead, had no choice but to surrender. He bent the knee to Robert, swearing fealty once more. He was allowed to keep his life and his lordship, a sign of Robert's surprising capacity for mercy, or perhaps just his desire to go home and find a drink. The lore coda for the Siege of Pike is a lesson in the long-term consequences of political humiliation. On the surface, the rebellion's end was a triumph for the Baratheon dynasty, solidifying its power and proving the unity of the realm. But the peace was secured by taking Balon's last surviving son, Theon, as a ward and hostage to be raised by Ned Stark in Winterfell. This act, intended to ensure Balon's loyalty, instead planted a seed of profound bitterness in the Lord of Pike, and created a deeply fractured identity in his son. Theon's struggle between his upbringing with the Starks and his loyalty to his grim father would, years later, lead him to make a series of disastrous choices that would bring ruin upon the very family that had raised him. The siege ended one war, but it laid the direct, personal groundwork for the tragedies of the next. The ashes of the Greyjoy rebellion have long since cooled, and the continent has fallen into its old habits. The king, Robert Baratheon, is dead. His supposed son, the petulant and cruel Joffrey, sits the Iron Throne. But Robert's brothers both contest the claim. The War of the Five Kings is raging, and we have arrived at the gates of the capital itself. Welcome to the Battle of the Blackwater. Picture this. You are a soldier in the fleet of Stannis Baratheon, the one true king by every law of succession. You have sailed into Blackwater Bay, and victory feels inevitable. Your fleet is immense, over 200 ships, the largest naval force seen in generations. The city's defenses look paltry. A few scorpions on the walls. A golden armored boy king prancing on the battlements. A massive chain boom lies slack under the water, but it is not yet raised. The city is yours for the taking. The mood is one of grim, righteous confidence. Then you see it. A single ship sailing out from the city's docks. It is unmanned. It moves like a ghost ship, leaking a thick, green, tinged substance into the bay. It is not an attack ship. It is bait. Before the alarm can be properly raised, a single flaming arrow is fired from the city walls. It arcs high, a tiny spark in the night sky, and then it drops. The world becomes a roaring, green inferno. This is not a battle. This is a trap. The defense of King's Landing fell to the one man everyone in the city seemed to despise, Tyrion Lannister. The imp, acting as hand of the king in his father's stead. He was facing an impossible situation. Stannis Baratheon was a famously methodical and experienced commander, and his force vastly outnumbered the city's defenders. A conventional defense was doomed to fail. Tyrion, a student of history and human nature, knew that to win, he couldn't play by the rules. He had to cheat. His secret weapon was not a sword or a strategy. It was a substance, a whispered horror from the city's past. Wildfire, the Alchemists' Guild, a shadowy organization that was part scientific society and part pyromaniac cult, had been commissioned to produce thousands of jars of this volatile, magical napalm. Wildfire is not just fire. It burns on water, melts steel, and seeps into flesh, its green flames notoriously difficult to extinguish. Tyrion's plan was a masterpiece of calculated, monstrous desperation. He allowed the bulk of Stannis' fleet to enter the confines of the bay, then raised the great chain behind them, trapping them. The unmanned ship was his delivery system. When it was breached by the flaming arrow, the entire surface of the Blackwater Bay became a single, explosive device. Let's just say this was less a naval battle and more a large-scale industrial accident, deliberately staged. The resulting explosion of green fire was apocalyptic. Entire ships vaporized in an instant. The sound was a deafening roar that shook the city to its foundations, followed by the collective, high-pitched scream of 10,000 men burning alive. The heat was so intense it warped the stone of the city walls. The bay itself became a churning cauldron of green flame, boiling men inside their armor. Stannis Baratheon, the rigid commander who planned for every contingency, had no contingency for this. His meticulously organized invasion fleet was transformed into a floating graveyard, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective strategy is weapons-grade insanity. The fire broke the back of the naval assault, but the battle was not over. Thousands of Stannis's men had already made it to shore, and were now assaulting the city's gates with a desperate fury. The battle shifted from a naval catastrophe to a brutal, grinding siege. The defenders, a mix of gold cloaks and conscripted citizens led by the scarred and cynical Sandor Clegane, were pushed to their breaking point. Clegane, terrified of the fire that had scarred him as a child, eventually deserted his post. Tyrion Lannister, the man who had orchestrated the inferno, was forced to lead a sortie himself, a dwarf in ill-fitting armor fighting in the muck and blood outside the gates he had so brilliantly and horribly defended. The lore coda for the Battle of the Blackwater is a cynical lesson in the nature of power. Tyrion's wildfire gambit and his personal bravery saved the city, but he received no glory for it. Stannis's army was on the verge of victory when, at the last possible moment, a massive host under the command of Tywin Lannister and the newly allied House Tyrell appeared and smashed the exhausted attackers from behind. They were hailed as the city's saviors. Tyrion, severely wounded in the fighting, was cast aside, his contributions ignored. The battle secured the Lannister grip on the Iron Throne, but it did so through a combination of chemical warfare, desperate courage, and a last-minute political alliance. It proved that in the Game of Thrones, victory rarely goes to the righteous. It goes to whoever has the most men, the dirtiest tricks, and the best timing. We leave the petty squabbles of southern kings behind. We leave the world of politics, ambition, and greed. Our journey now takes us north, beyond the wall, into a land of endless winter where the laws of men hold no sway. Welcome to the Fist of the First Men, a place where survival itself is the only victory worth having. Forget the heat of dragonfire or wildfire. Picture this, a cold so profound it feels like a physical presence. A cold that seeps into your bones and steals the breath from your lungs. You are a man of the Night's Watch, one of 300 sent on a great ranging into the haunted forest. The silence is the most terrifying part, a dead, watchful quiet that smothers all sound. You and your brothers have taken position on a fortified, ancient ring fort, the Fist of the First Men, waiting for word on the movements of the wildlings. But the wildlings are not what you should be afraid of. The air grows colder still. A mist rises unnatural and swift. Then you hear it, a horn blast, echoing through the frozen trees. One blast for rangers returning. A second blast follows. 2 blasts for wildlings. Every man grips his weapon, preparing for an attack. Then, the sound that freezes the blood. A third blast. A sound not heard in thousands of years. The signal for one thing only. The others. This was not a battle for a throne. This was a battle for the dawn. The Night's Watch, under the command of the grizzled Lord Commander Jair Mormont, had marched north to counter the threat of Mansraider, the king beyond, the wall who had united the disparate wildling clans. The Watchers' mission was one of reconnaissance and disruption. They were prepared to fight a conventional, if difficult, war against a mortal foe. Their entire strategic framework was based on a fundamental and fatal misunderstanding of the true threat. They were looking for the smoke, and they missed the fire that was about to consume them. The enemy that emerged from the woods was not a horde of screaming wildlings. It was a silent, marching army of the dead. Waits. Corpses reanimated by a power that defied comprehension, their eyes burning with a cold blue light. These were not the slow, shambling monsters of children's stories. They were relentless, tireless, and intelligent puppets, directed by the true enemy, the others, the White Walkers, ancient beings of ice and shadow that had passed into myth. The Night's Watch had planned for a skirmish. They were now facing a theological crisis with swords. Let's be clear. This was an intelligence failure of apocalyptic proportions. Lord Commander Mormont had led a military expedition deep into hostile territory, based on the assumption that his opponents were human. He discovered, far too late, that he had stumbled into the opening battle of a war against death itself. His men, armed with steel swords that shattered against the supernatural cold of the other's armor, were hopelessly outmatched. The Whites felt no pain, no fear. They were a tide of undeath, and every man who fell was simply a new recruit for the opposing side. It was a human resource model based on necromancy, and it was brutally effective. The fighting on the Fist was a desperate, hopeless slaughter. Men hacked at corpses that would not stop coming. They lit fires that seemed to shrink from the unnatural cold. They watched in horror as their friends and brothers were slain, only to rise again moments later, their eyes now burning with that same hateful blue light. The Watch was not just being attacked, it was being disassembled and repurposed by an enemy that did not recognize the concept of death as a permanent state. This was not warfare. It was a hostile, supernatural audit of the living. The defense of the Fist collapsed into a chaotic, doomed retreat. The living were routed by the dead. Lord Commander Mormont and a handful of survivors managed to break through the cordon of corpses and flee back towards the wall, leaving the vast majority of their brothers to be consumed by the advancing winter. They carried no victory, no intelligence on Mansraider. They carried only a terrifying truth, a message that the forgotten tales were real and that the true enemy was no longer sleeping. The lore coda for the Battle of the Fist of the First Men is one of cosmic dread. In the south, the battle meant nothing. It was an unknown tragedy in a forgotten land. But for the world, its significance was absolute. It was the first major engagement with the White Walkers in 8,000 years, and it was a catastrophic defeat for humanity. The Night's Watch, the sworn shield of the realms of men, was shattered, its strength broken, its leadership demoralized. The battle confirmed that the Long Night was not just a prophecy, it was a clear and present danger. The war for the Iron Throne was a child's game. The real war had just begun on a lonely, frozen hill with no one watching. Some of the bloodiest battles in history are not fought on a field. They are fought in halls, over dinner, with music playing. We now arrive at the most infamous event of the War of the Five Kings, an act so profoundly cynical it became a legend of treachery. This is not a battle. This is a violation. Welcome to the Red Wedding. Forget the clang of steel and the roar of a charge. Picture a feast hall. The air is stuffy, thick with the smell of cheap wine, roasted meat, and simmering resentment. You are a soldier in the army of Robb Stark, the king in the north. celebrating the marriage of your lord's uncle to a daughter of House Frey. The mood is strained. The music from the gallery is grating and poorly played. The hosts, the Freys, smile too much, their eyes holding no warmth. You are a guest, protected by the most sacred law of gods and Menzie guest right. Under this roof, no harm can come to you. You are safe. Then the music changes. The band begins to play a song that is not a wedding tune. It is The Rains of Castamere, a song about the total and brutal annihilation of a rebellious house by Tywin Lannister. It is a song of warning. The great doors of the hall are barred shut. Catelyn Stark, the king's mother, feels the arm of a nearby lord and finds not cloth, but chainmail. Hidden beneath his sleeve, a cold, sickening realization dawns. This is not a party. It is an abattoir. The context is one of military necessity and personal insult. Robb Stark, a tactical genius who had never lost a battle, had made a critical strategic error. He had broken a sworn oath to marry one of Lord Walder Frey's daughters, choosing instead to marry a foreign noblewoman for love. This act alienated House Frey, whose strategic control of the river crossing at the Twins was essential to the Northern War effort. This wedding was meant to be the apology, a diplomatic patching of the alliance. It was an olive branch extended by the Starks. But Walder Frey, a man whose entire personality was a monument to petty grievance, was not interested in apologies. And behind him, pulling the strings, was Tywin Lannister, who saw an opportunity to end a war without risking a single soldier of his own. This was not a battle. It was a meticulously planned assassination, a conspiracy between houses Lannister, Bolton, and Frey to decapitate the entire Northern Rebellion in one stroke. Let's be clear about what happened here. The sacred tradition of guest right, a cornerstone of social order in this world for thousands of years, was not just broken, it was weaponized. It was used as bait to lure an entire army's leadership into a kill box from which there was no escape. It was the ultimate act of bad faith. The slaughter was brutally efficient. From the musicians' gallery, crossbowmen revealed themselves and unleashed a volley of bolts into the unsuspecting Stark loyalists. Robb Stark was struck multiple times. His pregnant wife was stabbed repeatedly in the stomach, a targeted act of dynastic extermination. The hall descended into a screaming, bloody chaos. Men who were drinking and eating moments before were now fighting for their lives with dinner knives against armed and armored soldiers. Outside the hall, the Northern Army, drunk and celebrating in their own camps, were simultaneously set upon by their supposed allies. Their tents were set on fire, and men were cut down as they tried to flee, their guards completely down. It was a hostile corporate merger where the terms were written in blood. Robb Stark came to renegotiate a broken contract. Walder Frey and his partners in Lannister and Bolton Holdings LLC responded with a violent, non-negotiable dissolution of the Stark senior management. The massacre was not just an act of war, it was an act of profound, cosmic cynicism. It was a statement that honor is a liability and trust is for fools. The final images are the ones that haunt the history's Catelyn Stark, in a final act of desperate grief, slitting the throat of a Frey hostage before her own throat is cut, and the final, grotesque insult of the victors, sewing the head of Robb's direwolf onto his decapitated body, mocking his title as the Young Wolf. The law coda for the Red Wedding is simple and devastating. It ended the war in the north. With one move, Tywin Lannister eliminated his most dangerous opponent. The Stark kingdom collapsed overnight. House Bolton was rewarded for its treachery with the wardenship of the North, ushering in an era of unparalleled cruelty. The Freys gained revenge, but were cursed in the eyes of gods and men. their house forever stained by the violation of the most sacred law. The Red Wedding became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered across the continent. A chilling testament to the fact that in the great game, a broken promise can be more deadly than any sword. We return to the far north, to the icy edge of the world. The handful of survivors from the Fist of the First Men have brought their terrifying news back to Castle Black. But there is no time for the world to listen. The threat they outrun has arrived at the gates. Welcome to the Battle of Castle Black. Picture the scene. You are standing atop a wall of ice 700 feet high, looking down at a sea of torches that stretches to the horizon. 100,000 wildlings, an army of free folk, giants, and mammoths, all united under Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. They are not here merely to raid. They are fleeing the true north, running from the White Walkers. They do not want to conquer Westeros. They want to escape oblivion. And you, a brother of the Night's Watch, are standing in their way. Your entire fighting force consists of 105 men. The odds are not just bad. They are a statistical absurdity. The defense of the realm, the sworn purpose of your ancient order, now rests on a skeleton crew of criminals, exiles, and disgraced nobles in a crumbling, half-abandoned castle. The context is one of pure, unadulterated desperation. The Night's Watch is at its weakest point in centuries. The southern kingdoms are consumed by their own war, and have forgotten you exist. Mance Rayder's host is not an army of conquest. It is a refugee crisis armed with spears and led by giants. They must get south of the wall, or the army of the dead will claim them all. Your orders are simple, absolute, and impossible. Hold the wall. This is less a battle, and more a comically underfunded government agency facing a catastrophic systems failure. Castle Black is a dilapidated outpost with failing infrastructure and a severe staffing shortage. The men tasked with its defense are the dregs of society, led by Sir Eliza Thorne, a man whose bitterness is his primary leadership quality. The defense of Western civilization is being managed by a man who would be a nightmare to work with in any office environment. It falls to Jon Snow, the brooding bastard of Winterfell, to rally the demoralized defenders, becoming the de facto adult in the room because the actual management is hopelessly out of its depth. The assault comes from two directions. One force, led by the cannibal Thens, scales the wall itself to attack from above and behind. The main army attacks the gate at the base. The fighting is brutal and personal. It is a desperate struggle of the few against the many. On top of the wall, men drop barrels of oil, frozen gravel, and anything else they can find onto the climbers below. At the gate, a single giant, with the strength of a dozen oxen, attempts to smash its way through the iron, barred tunnel. A handful of brothers, armed with spears and unbelievable courage, hold it back. It is a battle of attrition where the defenders have nothing left to give. Let's just say the entire defensive strategy was a masterclass in making do. It was a grim, character-building exercise for everyone involved. The heroic stand at the gate, the frantic defense atop the wall. Jon Snow's duel in the courtyard with Star, the Magnar of the Thens. Every moment was a frantic improvisation against impossible odds. The defenders used their knowledge of the terrain and their sheer, stubborn refusal to break as their primary weapons. They were not fighting for a king or for glory. They were fighting because they were the last line. The battle reached its emotional climax when Jon's former lover, the wildling Ygritte, died in his arms, a personal tragedy in the midst of a global crisis. A reminder that every combatant on the other side was a person, not a monster. The lore coda for the Battle of Castle Black is a study in unexpected salvation. The Night's Watch held the wall for a night, a miracle of resilience, but they were shattered. They could not possibly survive a second assault. Jon Snow, in a desperate gamble, went to parley with Mance Rayder, intending to assassinate him. But the decision was taken from him. In the grey light of dawn, a new sound was heard. The charge of heavy cavalry. Stannis Baratheon, having heard the warnings from the north, had brought his army to the wall. His disciplined knights smashed into the disorganized wildling host, crushing them completely. The battle was won not by the Watch, but by a southern king who finally chose to fight the real war. This intervention saved the Night's Watch, but more importantly, it brought one of the 5 kings face to face with the true existential threat. The long-ignored war in the north had now become the central conflict of the age. We return to the north, where the consequences of the Red Wedding have festered under the cruel rule of House Bolton. A reckoning is coming. This is not a battle for a throne, but for a home. It is a fight for the very soul of the north, a deeply personal conflict between 2 men who represent everything the other is not. Welcome to the Battle of the Bastards. Picture yourself standing in a muddy field opposite the ancestral home you mean to reclaim, Winterfell. You are a wildling or a man from a minor northern house, loyal to the Stark name. Your army is a patchwork force, outnumbered and out-equipped. Your commander is Jon Snow, a man of immense courage and questionable impulse control. Your enemy is Ramsay Bolton, a man whose reputation for cruelty is not an exaggeration. It is a core component of his military strategy. The battle begins not with a charge, but with a game. A sick, psychological torture. Ramsay brings out his prisoner, Rickon Stark, Jon's youngest brother. He tells him to run across the field to his brother. Then, as the boy runs, Ramsay begins loosing arrows. It is a calculated act of torment designed for an audience of one Jon Snow, and it works perfectly. Jon, abandoning all tactical sense, charges forward alone to save his brother. Rickon is struck down moments before he can reach safety. The trap is sprung. The battle has begun, not with a strategy, but with a raw, emotional, and foolish mistake. The context here is pure vengeance and restoration. Jon Snow, resurrected and free of his Night's Watch vows, seeks to liberate his home from the man who tortured his sister and murdered his family's allies. Ramsay Bolton, the newly minted Warden of the North, seeks to extinguish the last remnants of House Stark and solidify his sadistic reign. The entire affair is less a military engagement and more a bloody, high-stakes personality clash. One man is defined by honor, the other by its complete absence. The result is one of the most savage and visceral battles in modern memory. Let's be blunt. Jon Snow's emotional response nearly led to a complete catastrophe. His solitary charge forced his own cavalry to follow, straight into a prepared Bolton trap. What followed was not a battle of tactics, but a descent into pure, medieval chaos. The Bolton forces, disciplined and ruthless, executed a classic pincer movement, a double envelopment that surrounded Jon's smaller army completely. They locked shields, forming a circle of death, and slowly, with agonizing patience, began to close the ring, crushing the wildlings and Stark loyalists into a panicked, suffocating mass. The reality of this battlefield was a special kind of hell. This was not the clean fire of dragons or the green flame of wildfire. This was suffocation. It was a mountain of bodies, living and dead, piled so high that men were not killed by swords, but were crushed under the weight of their own comrades. The air was thick with the screams of the dying and the stench of mud and blood. The Bolton archers fired blind volleys into the writhing mass of humanity, killing friend and foe alike. their only goal to heighten the chaos. Jon Snow himself disappeared under the press, nearly drowning in a sea of bodies, clawing his way back to the surface for a single, desperate breath. It was the physical manifestation of a panic attack, scaled up to the size of an army. Ramsay Bolton's strategy was not just military, it was psychological. He sought to create a spectacle of such absolute horror that his enemies' will to fight would simply dissolve. He was not just defeating an army, he was conducting a grand performance of cruelty. For a time, it seemed he would succeed. The Stark forces were spent, trapped, and on the verge of total annihilation. The lore coda for the Battle of the Bastards is a lesson in the value of pragmatic pessimism. Just as all hope was lost, a horn blew in the distance. The Knights of the Vale, summoned by Sansa Stark in a secret plea to Littlefinger, smashed into the rear of the Bolton army. The trap was broken, and the battle turned into a rout. Winterfell was retaken. The battle ended the Bolton reign of terror and restored House Stark. Jon Snow was hailed as a hero and declared king in the north. But the victory was not his alone. It was secured by Sansa's political maneuvering, a cynical act of desperation that saved them all, but also indebted the North to one of the most dangerous men in Westeros. The battle was won, but it proved that Jon's heroic idealism was a liability, and that Sansa had learned a harsh, but necessary, lesson from her time as a political prisoner. Trust no one, and always have a secret army up your sleeve. We have arrived at the end of all things. The culmination of every warning, every prophecy, every battle fought in ignorance of the true threat. The squabbles of kings and lords fall away into irrelevance. The Great War is here. The army of the dead has come to Winterfell, and the fate of every living thing hangs in the balance. This is the long night. Picture the deepest, darkest, coldest night of your life, and then multiply it by an eternity. You are standing on the battlements of Winterfell, a soldier in the last army the world will ever know. Before you is a silent, endless ocean of the dead. You cannot see where it ends. The cold they bring with them is not natural, it is a physical weight, a crushing presence that extinguishes hope. There is no shouting from the enemy lines, no war horns, only a profound, dead silence that is more terrifying than any scream. This is not a war against men. It is a war against a concept. You are fighting the end of the world. The stakes are, for the first time in our survey, absolute. The leader of the dead, the Night King, is not seeking a throne or territory. His objective is erasure. He has come to kill Brandon Stark, the three-eyed raven, the boy who holds within him the entire memory of mankind. If Bran dies, the history of the world dies with him. Every story, every song, every life, every death, all of it will vanish, leaving behind nothing but an endless, silent winter. The defenders gathered at Winterfell, a desperate coalition of Starks. Targaryens, wildlings, and knights are not just fighting for their lives. They are fighting for the idea that life itself is worth remembering. The battle plan of the living was a masterpiece of hopeful desperation, and it failed at every single turn. The first move was a cavalry charge by the Dothraki, their curved blades set aflame by a red priestess. They rode into the darkness as a wave of fire, a glorious and beautiful sight that lasted for approximately 90 seconds before their lights were systematically, silently extinguished. It was a charge into a void. Let's just say it was a catastrophic market entry strategy, a product launch that met with total consumer indifference. The living had brought passion and fury. The dead brought only mathematics. What followed was a systematic dismantling of every conventional military tactic. Defensive trenches, meant to be a wall of fire, were lit too late, and were quickly overcome by whites, who simply threw their bodies onto the flames to create bridges for the others. The castle walls, which had stood for centuries, became ladders for a tidal wave of corpses that swarmed over the battlements. Even the ultimate weapons, the two living dragons, found themselves nearly neutralized by a supernatural blizzard conjured by the Night King. Their fire-breathing advantage lost in an icy fog as they battled their own reanimated brother, the Ice Dragon Viserion. This was not a battle. It was a siege on existence itself, and the defenders were losing on every front. The fighting devolved into a series of desperate, claustrophobic last stands in the courtyards and halls of the ancient castle. Heroes and knights who had survived countless battles against men found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer, tireless tide of the dead. It was a lesson in the futility of individual heroism against a foe that operates as a single, implacable organism. The defenders were facing an enemy with a perfect supply chain, where every one of your casualties becomes one of their assets. The lore coda for the Long Night is the ultimate subversion of epic warfare. As the last defenses collapsed and the Night King himself stood before Bran in the Godswood, his victory absolute, the final blow came not from a dragon or a king. It came from the shadows. Arya Stark, using the skills of stealth, assassination, and misdirection she had learned over years of suffering, launched herself out of the darkness. In a single, fluid motion, she plunged a dagger of Valyrian steel into the Night King. He shattered into a billion shards of ice. And with his death, his entire army, every White Walker and every White, collapsed into dust. The war was won, not by an army, but by a single girl with a very specific skill set. It was won by an assassin. The Great War was over, but the cost was immense. Half the army of the living was gone. The survivors were left to stare at a dawn they never thought they would see, broken and exhausted. The single greatest threat in history was defeated, but its end only served to immediately highlight the tragic, petty nature of what was to come, the final, squalid argument over who got to sit on the Iron Throne. The world was saved, but it had learned very little.